Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Bob Odette, and this is our first show on WePodcast. Hopefully, it'll be the first of many to come, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Our goal for The Rabbit Hole is to become a call-in show, where you, the viewer, will have a chance to voice your opinion on topics we bring up. Of course, that means we'll have to build an audience we don't currently have, so the first few shows will just be me talking about issues I believe are important to everybody. In the coming weeks, we'll be looking into things our government at all levels are doing or not doing. Right now, the big issue in Windsor is water, or more specifically, rainwater. With an unprecedented number of Windsor homes being flooded this past few days, there is talk of the cause of flooding being a rare occurrence, and local officials point out that any infrastructure upgrades still would not be able to handle the amount of water that fell this past Tuesday. Well, I am of the thought that rains such as we experienced on Tuesday may not be as rare in the future as they have been in the past. The city should keep that in mind when considering infrastructure upgrades, but that is something we can delve into in more detail later. We'll also look at provincial and national politics. Are the Liberal parties at both levels of government doing what's best for the people or what's best for the Liberal Party? Does Kathleen Wynne have a good take at what the people of Ontario want or need, or is she just playing to the majority of Toronto voters in the Toronto area? What has Trudeau done so far for Canada at the national level? Personally, I think legalizing weed is a good idea, but it is not an issue that affects the majority of the population, and there are problems I see with it unfolding, especially as it pertains to driving and the ability of authorities to accurately measure the level of intoxication of drivers on the road. That's just on topic of concern with the feds in Ottawa. There are many more, such as our relationship with First Nations people and other Indigenous groups across Canada. There's also immigration and job concerns among millions of Canadians who take political issues seriously. Then there are the considerations having to do with international issues. The United States has reached a point where the usual concerns are complicated by an American president who is unwilling or unable to see things as they truly are. It will take a special effort on the part of our leaders to deal with this, and we will look to see what they're doing and how effective it has been and will be. In the broader world sense, how are we here in Windsor, Essex affected by terrorism, if at all? Will more free trade deals and more open markets in the rest of the world going to benefit or harm our job prospects here in Windsor, Essex? These are issues that impact our lives every day, and I want to hear from you. How are you doing? Are you working at a job you enjoy, just tolerate, or hate and do simply because you have no other choice in today's economy? But there are other issues that don't really affect our day-to-day lives, but are interesting just the same. Conspiracy issues, aside from porn, one of the fastest growing sectors of the internet, include a huge variety of topics, and I find them quite interesting while I consider some absolute nonsense. But I want to know what you think. Was 9/11 an inside job? Is there a secret order of elites who control the world, or is it just a bunch of rich guys trying to get richer? Is religion good or evil? Is there really a God? Is Western civilization going to continue to be a democracy, or are we headed towards dictatorship and tyranny? My own thoughts see population growth as having a huge influence on these issues. There is no more frontier in the world, grown smaller as more and more people are born, and modern medicine allows us to live longer. Should we be devoting more resources to space travel and colonization at this point in our history, or should we concentrate most of our efforts on cleaning up the world we know now? These are just some of the questions I have in mind, and I want to know if you're asking yourself the same things. Or do you have questions of your own about issues I'm not aware of? As I said, once we get rolling and build an audience among you, the viewers, we'll be able to talk about whatever you want to talk about. Once the WePodcast app is released, we can get the phone lines or comment sections open. up to hear you. But until that takes place, our conversation will be one-sided, with me doing most of the talking. And I hope you'll excuse the fact that I'm actually reading this right now. Later, things will get a little better. I hope I don't bore you. That's the last thing I want to happen. So just drop us a line and let us know how it is working out for you as we start out here. As for today's show, the first show from the rabbit hole, I have to ask you, what were you doing on September 26, 1983? I actually know what I was doing. It was only 2 days after my wedding to the woman I'm still married to, and we were on our honeymoon. We had just arrived in Fort Frances, Ontario, where we began a week of hanging out with my wife's best friend and her husband, who was unable to make it to the wedding. We were young, just starting a life together, which turned out pretty well as I look back at it. But as you will come to realize, it could have ended that day for most of us and led to the destruction of the world we seem to take for granted now. That was the day Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, literally saved the world from a nuclear holocaust. He was a duty officer at the Oko nuclear early warning system, and I don't know exactly where that was, but they were responsible for monitoring the skies in their sector around Russia to detect any missiles or jets that may have entered Russian airspace with the intent of bombing a major Russian city. It was Petrov's job to assess any warnings the system provided, and it was his job to decide whether to report a warning to the Kremlin in Moscow, or higher authorities would decide what response was necessary. Well, on September 26, 1983, it was a Monday. The Soviet early warning system alerted the men at Oko to a nuclear missile had just been launched by the United States and was heading for Russia. In the next few minutes, the system reported 5 more missiles. It looked to them that the U.S. had just started World War III. All eyes turned to Petrov, as he was the guy who had to make a decision very fast. At first, he ordered everybody to run diagnostic tests on their computers to ensure everything was working properly. He had about 20 minutes, I think, to make a decision. He knew the system was relatively new and was not sure if it was 100% reliable. But the diagnostic tests, all reported everything was working fine. As the men he was working with urged him to report the attack to the Kremlin, he hesitated. According to his statements later, he said that they were taught that a U.S. attack would include many hundreds of missiles rocketing to targets all across Russia. But here, he could only see 5 or 6. It didn't seem right to him. He ordered more diagnostic testing of the computers. As the minutes ticked on, his co-workers urged him to pass the word to higher authorities, but he resisted their pleas. He decided the best way to go would be to wait until the missiles were within range of ground radar, which he knew would provide a real picture of what was happening. But the radar wouldn't see anything until the missiles were a few minutes from their targets. In the documentary of the incident, which included a dramatization of what was going on in the Oko facility with actors, and it was like a movie. Petrov is seen being told by his associates to pass on the word. They have done it before, he told them, referring to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One man pressed that America was the only country in history to use a nuclear bomb against another country. The pressure was huge, but Petrov held his ground as he waited for the radar sites to issue their real-time reports. After 20 minutes or so that seemed like hours, Russian radar operators reported no missiles when they should have been able to see what the computers said was coming. It was a computer glitch, after all. Everybody in the facility cheered Petrov. An associate who was standing next to him shook his hand and hugged him, saying, "You saved the world." Petrov sat in a chair and began to cry. According to Russian UN officials years later, a nuclear retaliation requires that multiple sources confirm an attack. So Petrov's report would have had to have been corroborated by another source, according to these Russian reps at the UN. Bruce Blair, a nuclear security expert and a research scholar at the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, said the top leadership, given only a couple minutes to decide, told that an attack had been launched, would make a decision to retaliate. Had Petrov reported incoming missiles to his superiors, they might have launched an assault against the U.S., which would have resulted in a corresponding nuclear response from America. At the time, Russian paranoia was high. The United States had been conducting an operation called Autumn Forge, which included moving about 40,000 U.S. and NATO troops across Western Europe that looked to the Russians like a prelude to an invasion. About 3 weeks prior to the Oko incident, Russian fighter jets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, which aroused deep animosity in the West. They knew they screwed up and were thinking something would come from the other side in response. Autumn Forge just added more tension to their situation. In a story from The Atlantic magazine in 2013, I quote, "An ailing 69-year-old Yuri Andropov was running the Soviet Union at the time from his Moscow bed as the United States and its NATO allies conducted the war games that seemed to confirm some of his darkest fears." 2 years earlier, Andropov had ordered KGB officers around the globe to gather evidence for what he was certain was coming. A surprise nuclear strike by the U.S. would decapitate the Soviet leadership. While many of these KGB officers didn't believe that the U.S. had such plans, they dutifully supplied the Kremlin with whatever suspicious evidence they could find, feeding official paranoia. So regardless of Russian protocol, which required corroborating evidence, the level of paranoia on the Russian side might have led them to undertake a nuclear retaliation in the face of a threat, real or not. That would certainly have led the United States unleashing their nuclear missiles in response. The result of all this would have seen major cities on both sides of the world obliterated by nuclear bombs, and it is a sure bet that Detroit, with its massive manufacturing facilities at the time, would have been a target. People in Windsor would have been blinded by an explosion just seconds before massive destruction that would have instantly killed everyone within miles of the strike. The same thing would have happened in cities across North America. My wife and I, in Fort Francis, along with our hosts, would have seen missiles streaking across the sky as they moved in a direction from the north towards the American targets they were headed for. We might not have seen an actual mushroom cloud from where we were, but I'm sure we would have heard the news on the emergency broadcast system we have set up for just such occasions. Where would you have been at that time? For those of you who are not even born yet, what would the prospects be in such a situation to have been born at all in a future that would have seen the disruption of almost everything we include in society? So Petrov, in my opinion, and in others, is a genuine hero. We all owe him a debt. But what happened to him? At first, he was praised for his decisions, but that soon dissipated in the Cold War atmosphere of the time. General Yuri Voltintsev, commander of Soviet Air Defense's missile defense units, did praise him at first and promised a reward for his actions. But later, the incident was hidden because the Russians did not want it to get out that their warning system had malfunctioned. Petrov was reprimanded for not keeping his log up to date as the incident unfolded, and eventually he left the Russian armed forces in disgust. According to an excellent documentary about him, aired earlier this year on PBS stations around the country, he spent a few months after taking care of his wife who had contracted cancer. The dramatization presented in the documentary shows him taking care of his wife. There was nothing Russian medicine could do for her, and she died in his arms one day. He had spent the previous months consoling her, holding her when she got sick, and trying to get her to eat as the cancer ate away at her body. The documentary, called The Man Who Saved the World, was directed by a Danish film director, Peter Anthony, and it premiered at the 2014 Woodstock Film Festival in Woodstock, New York. It won an honorable mention Audience Award for Best Narrative Feature and an honorable mention James Lyons Award for Best Editing of a Narrative Feature. According to the Wikipedia story on Petrov, on May 21st, 2004, the San Francisco-based Association of World Citizens gave him its World Citizen Award, along with a trophy and $1,000, quote, in recognition of the part he played in averting a catastrophe. On January 2006, Petrov traveled to the United States, where he was honored in a meeting at the United Nations in New York City. There, the Association of World Citizens presented him with a second Special Citizen Award. The next day, he met journalist Walter Cronkite at his CBS offices in New York. The interview with Cronkite, in addition to other highlights of Petrov's trip to the United States, is in the documentary. He had met Kevin Costner while in the United States at that time. Petrov said that Costner was his favorite American actor, and that people who brought him to the U.S. set up a meeting with Costner at a movie set where he was working. The actor stopped all activity on the movie set and introduced Petrov to the crew, telling him what he had done. Afterwards, everybody shook his hand and thanked him for what he did. In another scene, in a restaurant, I think, he also met Robert De Niro, who also thanked him for what he did back in 1983. For his actions in averting potential nuclear war, Petrov was also awarded the Dresden Prize in 2013 in Dresden, Germany. The award included $32,000 in cash, and on February 24th, he got an additional honor with the 2011 German Media Award presented to him at a ceremony in Baden-Baden, Germany. Petrov will turn 78 on September 9th this year, and he still lives in a small village outside of Moscow. Now, researching that story, I come across a list of further close calls due to malfunctions and screw-ups in the nuclear warning systems on both sides of the world. And they start in the 1950s. So on November 5th, 1956, and I'll have to read this for you. During the Suez Crisis, NORAD received a number of simultaneous reports, including unidentified aircraft over Turkey, Soviet MiGs over Syria, and a downed British bomber, and unexpected maneuvers by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet through the Dardanelles. It all appeared to signal a Soviet offensive. Considering previous Soviet threats to utilize conventional weapons against France and Great Britain, U.S. forces believed these events could trigger a NATO nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. In fact, all reports of Soviet action turned out to be wrong, misinterpreted, or exaggerated. The perceived threat was due to a coincidental combination of events, including a wedge of Swans over Turkey, a fighter escort for the Syrian president, a British bomber brought down by mechanical issues, and previously scheduled exercises of the Soviet fleet. So that was in 56, the year I was born, incidentally. In the 60s, we come right away, October 5th, 1960. Radar equipment in Thule, Greenland, mistakenly interpreted a moonrise over Norway as a large-scale Soviet missile launch. Upon receiving a report of the supposed attack, NORAD went on high alert that day. However, doubts about the authenticity of the attack arose due to the fact that the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was actually in New York as part of a UN delegation. So they ruled out possibilities that was happening. So we skip ahead to November 24th, 1961. Staff at the Strategic Air Command headquarters simultaneously lost contact with NORAD and multiple ballistic missile early warning sites. Since these communication lines were designed to be redundant and independent from one another, the communications failure was interpreted as either a very unlikely coincidence or a coordinated attack. SAC headquarters prepared the entire ready force for takeoff before already overheard aircraft confirmed that there did not appear to be an attack. So they had planes in the sky that didn't see what they thought they saw. It was later found that the failure of a single relay station in Colorado was the sole cause for the communication breakdown. And then, of course, in October 1962, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, of course, everybody knows what happened there. But there's one little item that maybe you don't know. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Soviet patrol submarine, B-59, almost launched a nuclear-tipped torpedo while under harassment by American naval forces. One of several vessels surrounded by American destroyers near Cuba, the B-59 dived to avoid detection and was unable to communicate with Moscow for a number of days. The USS Beale began dropping practice depth charges to signal the B-59 to surface. However, the Soviet submarine took these to be real depth charges. With low batteries affecting the submarine's life support, and without orders from Moscow, the commander of the B-59 believed that a war may have already begun and ordered the use of a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo against the American fleet. The submarine political officer agreed, but the commander of the sub-flotilla, Vasily Arkhipov, persuaded the captain to surface and await orders. On the same day, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and another U-2, flown by U.S. Air Force Captain Charles Maltzby, strayed 300 miles into Soviet airspace. Despite orders to avoid Soviet airspace by at least 100 miles, a navigation error took the U-2 over the Chukotka Peninsula, causing Soviet MiG interceptors to scramble and pursue the aircraft. American F-102A interceptors armed with GAR-11 Falcon nuclear air-to-air missiles, each with a quarter-kiloton yield, were then scrambled to escort the U-2 into friendly airspace. I guess individual pilots were capable of arming and launching their own missiles. In 1965, November 9th, the command center of the Office of Emergency Planning went on full alert after a massive power outage in the northeast United States. Actually, remember that. The power outage. Several nuclear bomb detectors used to distinguish between regular power outages and power outages caused by a nuclear blast near major U.S. cities malfunctioned due to circuit areas, creating the illusion of a nuclear attack. Then in 1967, May 23rd, a powerful solar flare, accompanied by a coronal mass ejection, interfered with multiple NORAD radars over the northern hemisphere. This interference was initially interpreted as intentional jamming of the radars by the Soviets, thus an act of war. A nuclear bomber counterstrike was nearly launched by the USA. Then we move into the 1970s. On November 9th, 1979, a computer error at NORAD headquarters led to alarm and full preparation for a non-existent large-scale Soviet attack. NORAD notified the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, that the Soviet Union had launched 250 ballistic missiles with a trajectory for the United States, stating that the decision to retaliate would need to be made by the president within 3 to 7 minutes. So here we have the same situation that happened a few years later in Russia, only this time it's in the U.S. The Strategic Air Command was notified nuclear bombers prepared for takeoff and ICBM crews were presumably placed on alert. Within 6 to 7 minutes of the initial response, satellite and radar systems were able to confirm that the attack was a false alarm. So we're saved by radar again. It was found that a training scenario was inadvertently loaded into an operational computer. Commenting on the incident, U.S. State Department Advisor Marshall Schuman stated that false alerts of this kind are not a rare occurrence. There is complacency about handling them that disturbs me, he said. In the months following the incident, there were 3 more false alarms at NORAD, 2 of them caused by faulty computer chips. Then, in 1980, March 15th, one of 4 Soviet missiles launched from a submarine near the Kuril Islands is detected by an American early warning sensor and determined to be heading towards the United States. And then in 83, we had the incident I told you about earlier. Now, in 1995, there was another incident. Russian President Boris Yeltsin became the first world leader to activate a nuclear briefcase after Russian radar system detected the launch of a Norwegian Black Branch 12 research rocket being used to study the Northern Lights. Russian strategic ballistic missile submarines were put on alert in preparation for a possible retaliatory strike. When it became clear that the rocket did not pose a threat to Russia and was not part of a larger attack, the alarm was canceled. Russia was, in fact, one of a number of countries earlier informed of the launch. However, the information had not reached the Russian radar operators. Then on October 23rd, 2010, which is the last incident on this list I found, commanders at a U.S. Air Force base in Wyoming lost most forms of command control and security monitoring over 50 nuclear ICBMs for 45 minutes. The missiles were taken offline after a suspected hardware problem caused multiple errors with control computers. Although military officials maintained that the missiles remained under control and were not susceptible to outside attempts to gain control, former Air Force launch officer Bruce Blair expressed concerns that the missiles in this status could be vulnerable to launch attempts by hackers or compromise by missile crews. So the Petrov incident wasn't the only one. In my opinion, it's the most important one. We all could be gone if it wasn't for what he did. And I just wish I could meet the guy someday. But as I said earlier, he's going to turn 78, so that's it. So I hope you enjoyed our first broadcast. We'll be back, I hope, once a week and with more topics and stuff for you to think about. Thank you for watching.